revolution.
I'm excited to introduce my guest, Dan Riley. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Jerry. How are you today?
I am good. You know, I was looking at some of the material that I have on this case, and it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, this guy, Wayne Perry, was considered the Michael Jordan of the murder game. That just really blows my mind.
Yeah, Jerry, Wayne Perry was one of our most prolific killers in D.C. during the time when the violence in D.C. had just gotten completely out of control back in 1989, 1990, 91. The city was experiencing, just a rising tide of murders that had sort of started as a result of crack dealing, actually nationwide, but also because the individual street crews or gangs in D.C. Just got to a point where they were more and more violent. And the homicide rate got to a point where the D.C. police were just absolutely overwhelmed. It was kind of my job. I'd started with the first gang case that we had in D.C., which was the R Street crew. And my partner, John Kerr, and some of the other guys on my squad worked on other cases, the P Street crew, and then we also did the First Street crew with my partners from the D.C. police, Angela Parisi, and a couple of other police officers and detectives that were with us. We had formed the Safe Streets Task Force to deal with the problems of violence in the city, and we decided that we should go after the most significant targets that we could, either the gang itself or the gang that was responsible for the most violence. And so after we had been successful in the R Street crew investigation and the First Street crew investigation, which both involved a lot of violence and a drug operation that was fairly extensive, the D.C. police captain of homicide asked me to take on Wayne Perry. He was somebody we knew basically from our informant base and our confidential source base that was supposed to be just involved in almost every murder that happened in D.C. It was almost impossible for a serious drug dealer to be killed in D.C. that somebody didn't call in and say Wayne Perry did it.
Now, was he a drug dealer too?
No, he really, and that was a bit of a problem for us in the beginning stages because there was a lot of intelligence out there that was kind of wrong about him. They thought of him as a drug dealer, but he really was more of a killer, an extortionist, and somebody that basically used drug dealers and abused them and told them that they had to pay his money to him or they, would suffer consequences. And he also ended up teaching a lot of young men in the city how to be a killer. He had a little crew of guys throughout the city who had sort of learned from him his particular way of using murder to basically extend his power over the city. That's what I think it really came down to for him. He wanted to be in charge and in control and wanted to be the scariest guy in the city. And he did that by just intimidating everybody that he came across. When we first heard about him, it was like just a constant number of bodies that there was no real evidence on him, or if there was any evidence, it was usually an eyewitness, and that eyewitness either refused to testify or left the city or was murdered himself. And so what it came, and that was what the police were having problems with. They had this one murder of a guy named Froggy, named James Henson. They'd had an eyewitness to the murder, and she identified Perry as the shooter, and they put her in the grand jury to testify. They did everything they could to protect her, but he kidnapped her and drove her over into the southeast section of D.C., killed her, shot and killed her, and dumped her on the side of the road. So the D.C. police basically at that point were kind of at wit's end. They were experiencing so many murders that they were just trying to keep up with the numbers. And they asked us to see if we could take him on as a target, and that's what we did.
So who was he murdering?
Mostly he murdered, well, I mean, it's kind of difficult to say. He murdered a lot of young women, but he also murdered a lot of young drug dealers. And his claim that most of the people that he killed were in the business or in the game, but it just wasn't true. I mean, he killed this young woman, Alveda Hopkins, simply because she was willing to testify against him. She had the courage because her friend Henson had been killed, and she decided that she was not going to put up with that. She was going to do the right thing, which it was that kind of courage that really focused our attention in D.C. on trying to do everything we could for the community. The people that were willing to come forward were in her situation a lot of times. They were just in fear of their lives. So witnesses were killed. He killed other drug dealers, and he killed a lot of people for really no motive that you normally expect. I guess if you and I had ever killed somebody, it would be like in self-defense, or we'd kill somebody because maybe they harmed a member of our family, and we were just, overwrought and completely out of touch with our sense of right and wrong. But in his case, he would kill, I think, to exert power, to just show everybody that he had no qualms about taking somebody's life. And
when we talk about killing, how many people are we talking about?
Well, I mean, the informant base that we had said he was responsible for 50 or more killings. We knew that there were a number of killings that he did with other people. We also knew that he had killed at least 3 or 4 people when we first started our investigation because we had really good, solid intelligence on them. We had cooperating witnesses by this point who were talking to us on a regular basis and really being the voice of the community for us. I mean, people would call them snitches or whatever, but the reality was if we weren't getting their information, we were kind of at a loss as to where to go. Because our investigative efforts, and especially in Wayne Perry's case, you normally try to go out and interview witnesses and try to talk them into cooperating, try to talk them into going into a grand jury, talk them into, giving a full statement about what they saw or what they didn't see. And, that kind of relationship that you have to build with witnesses just wasn't there because the people were just too frightened. We had murder unrelated to Perry, but in Northeast Washington, where it was a bright sunny day, everybody was out on the stoop enjoying the afternoon, and 4 guys from the R Street crew just walked up and shot a man dead on the stoop of, a house that he just happened to be standing in front of. And when we went to do the interviews right after that murder happened, there was nobody that saw anything. And it was just crazy. It was like in the afternoon, bright sunny day, everybody saw it. They were all out there. But, the best we could get out of the straight-up witnesses was to just say that, they didn't see anything. And so we knew we were struggling with this. And in Perry's case, we thought it was even worse because anytime we got to a point where we thought we were going to be able to get a witness to one of his murders, they just disappeared. And the most important case like that happened to us on was a murder that happened in Potomac Gardens, which was a public housing project on Capitol Hill, and it was a double murder. It again happened in the morning. 2 men walked up to 2 drug dealers who sold heroin in Potomac Gardens and just shot both of them dead in front of a number of witnesses. The case ended up going to trial where one of Wayne's students, I guess is the best way to call him, Calvin Smith, Ace was his nickname, was charged in the murder. And he was with Perry when they did the double murder. But the 4 eyewitnesses that the police had developed and had developed a close relationship with refused to say anything about Perry. And when I heard about the case, I decided to go ahead and give some of the FBI support to just protecting these 4 witnesses. And when I had my opportunity, I went and talked to the 2. I'd had good informant intelligence that told us, how the murder had gone down. And I knew Perry was responsible and was there. And the four women who, were drug users and had their own personal problems just acted like they didn't even know who Perry was.
So they gave you information about the other people that were part of the murder, but did not even bring up his name.
Right. They wouldn't even talk about him. And and it was that level of fear that I just realized I was dealing with. Well, when we got to the trial phase of that particular case, which was early on, this was, I think we started the Perry case in somewhere in 1990. The Hinkle and Menace murder had happened in late 1990, and then we started our investigation in December of 1990. So the murder had happened early, and then we got the case, and it went to trial within the first couple of months after our investigation started. And so I did everything I could to try to talk to these women, to try to get them to start talking about the right thing, but they just refused. And so when they testified in court, the defense attorney knew exactly what the truth was and just basically ruined them on the stand. And so the guy who was actually charged with the case, Calvin Smith, he got off on possession of a handgun charge and was not convicted of the murder even. And I think it was because the four witnesses weren't telling the truth. And it was fairly obvious that from the jury's perspective that there was a second guy there who actually pulled the trigger, and they refused to talk about him. So under those conditions, I knew what we were going to be dealing with. Even if we had the witness and had, the appropriate information from the witness, we could be struggling all the way until the very, last part of the investigation when we were trying to go to trial in the case. So,
could you tell me a little bit more about how he operated? Because you said something about an extortionist with drug dealers. Could you give me some examples of that?
Well, he one of the guys that he killed later was a really well-known drug dealer by the name of Michael Salters, and I had a confidential source who he had a close relationship with Salters, and was present at some party at a concert, and Perry just walked up to him and started patting him on the pocket, and this was an older man. He's like 50 in his 50s. And Perry's patting him on his pocket and saying, what you got for me today? And Salters was not a shy or retiring type of person to begin with, but he still gave him money. And that's kind of how Perry operated. He would go up to the people that he knew were making lots of money and basically take money from them by saying, you want me to be your friend. If you don't want me to be your friend, don't give me any money. But if you want me to be your friend, you better give me some money. And if you're going to give me money, I'm not going to go after you. That was kind of his approach to a lot of the major drug dealers in the city. And
what amount of money are we talking about?
Several thousand each time. I mean, you didn't give him pocket change. You gave him whatever you could. Most of these guys, as you could probably guess, most of these pretty well-established drug dealers would usually have large amounts of cash in their pocket. And that's kind of how he operated. But he also did it at a much larger level. It turned out that there was a big transition period going on at this time where cocaine was coming in from a lot of different directions. And a New York drug dealer by the name of Albert Geddes Martinez moved from New York to the D.C. area. And he started supplying drugs to various drug dealers in the D.C. area and also in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He got immediately targeted and shot by some Northeast killers that Perry knew but wasn't really close with. And this put Martinez in a bad position. He was, first of all, in the hospital and thought he was going to die. So he confessed all of his drug dealing activities to my partner, Angelo Parisi.
Like a deathbed confession?
It was very similar to that. In other words, he thought he was going to die and he didn't have anything to lose. And he just told Angelo everything that he was doing. who he was distributing drugs with down in Fredericksburg. And, Angelo was just the kind of detective that would just, hey, I'll take what you give me. I'll give, and just let him talk, let him get the information. So he did a great interview and was walking out of the hospital and going to come back the next day because he really didn't expect Martinez to live. But when he came back the next day, Martinez was gone from the hospital. Overnight, he had apparently recovered to the extent that he could from his gunshot wound. And he had called up and made contact with Perry, and Perry became his vice president of security. Now, Martinez had lots of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars that he made from distributing cocaine from New York down to D.C. He had a strong connection with South American drug dealers through the Dominican Republic, and so he had left New York under pretty bad conditions. There were about 4 or 5 people who wanted to kill him up there. He had been involved in the murder of a friend of a major drug dealer in Harlem. There, Perry never had to, touch drugs or do anything of that nature. Because of Martinez's need to keep hidden, the two of them became like vampires. Like they never showed up during the daytime anywhere. They would show up late at night at clubs and basically do business, from about midnight till about 4 or 5 in the morning, and then go hide off in a hotel room somewhere, or they ended up getting some pretty well hidden apartments. So that made my investigation that much more complicated because I had no real way to even target him for surveillance, target Perry for surveillance. So what we did was we said, with the information that we had on the drug dealing from Detective Parisi, he got up with Scott Yao from our drug unit, and they put together an indictable case in Fredericksburg, Virginia, on Martinez. I knew that we had to get him locked up so that Perry would kind of resurface and start living a little bit of a normal life, so I could, start working an investigation, appropriately against him. So Martinez was, in that respect, just simply hiding out in D.C. He had to continue to operate. He continued to have a good source of cocaine, so he had plenty of ways to make money. But he needed somebody, to protect him, and he needed some way to keep hidden from the drug dealers in New York. Now, this became important to us later on another murder that Perry ended up doing. So we're looking right now at, say, the summer of 1991. Yeah, summer of 1991. By this point, Perry and Martinez were directly connected. They were like twin brothers, going out every night. And Martinez had 4 or 5 people that he was distributing drugs through and just getting his product out on the street and making lots of money and making Perry a wealthy man in the process. So my best approach was to develop as many informants as we could to try to get us information about getting Martinez. Still in the back of my mind, I knew we weren't going to make it with the help of just regular civilian witnesses. We were going to have to use forensics and all of the other resources that we had at our disposal at the time. But what I didn't realize was Martinez was in this vice. If he ever got arrested by us, he was going to, he had to make a decision whether he was going to cooperate with us or go back to New York and face death almost immediately. Because even if he was sent up there and put in a prison or in a jail awaiting trial on this murder kidnapping case, he was cooked. Everybody said that he would get killed as soon as he hit a jail in New York City. So that was something I didn't really account for in my case. I just had this gut feeling that we needed to get him out of the way. And so we developed a really good informant that told us exactly where Martinez and Perry were living and exactly what time we could get Martinez out in the open, with a chance of really arresting him. And that informant came through for us, and we arrested Martinez right after this series of murders in the summer. We knew that Martinez and Perry were responsible for the murder of Demencio Benson, Michael Salters, the drug dealer I was telling you about, and these were both in July of 91. Then they were responsible for the murder of Evelyn Carter, and then responsible for the murder of Yolanda Burley, and then Alveda Hopkins, the young woman who had testified against Perry. He finally got around to killing her. So all of this happened the summer before we locked up Martinez. We had a couple of breaks that happened right around that same time. We recovered a Q-45 Infinity that Perry had gotten in payment for another murder he had done almost a year earlier. And then in that Q-45 Infinity, we recovered the weapon that was used to kill Michael Salters. So that was the first piece of solid forensic evidence that we got that we knew would connect him with all of these string of murders that we knew they were responsible for in the summer. The next thing that we found out about was a Mazda van that they were driving around and using as kind of the FBI laboratory referred to it as the murder van. When we
Great.
when we recovered the van, we had been told that it had been cleaned after the murder of Garrett Terrell, one of the drug dealers that worked for Martinez. And we had our forensic team go over it, top to bottom. And they really said that it looked like more than one person had been murdered inside the van. But we did recover a bunch of blood off the back of the front driver's seat. And so I thought, based on the information that we started to develop about how the murder happened, that blood should have been Garrett Terrell's blood. But unfortunately, we ended up with a lab report that said found on Terrell's body was unique carpet fibers from the van. Not only carpet fibers from the storage area of the van, which was the back baggage compartment of the van, but carpet fibers from the front part of the van. So in other words, two sort of unique styles of carpet fiber that were on Terrell's body. So
you knew definitely he had
we knew he had been in the van. And we also found in the van fibers from his clothing that he had worn that night. And we also found his fingerprints in the van. So we knew he was in the van. And, of course, they shot him and left him out in the park, up in Rock Creek Park. And they stripped him down to make it look like it was some kind of sexual assault against him. But it was, very simply a homicide where they just were trying to make it look like it wasn't them who killed him. So that was how we were starting to put the thing together in terms of forensics. But it was frustrating for me at the time because DNA was brand new in terms of usage in our cases. And at that point, I was frustrated by the fact that we didn't have Terrell's DNA inside the van. And we couldn't find any DNA from the Q-45 Infinity that we had. So I knew anything we came up with, we were going to have significant forensic evidence to prove a case against Perry, because we really were in a position where we weren't going to be able to rely very much on civilian witnesses, regular witnesses. Because these murders that I'm talking about, there was only one murder that was done in front of people, and that was the murder of Demencio Benson. And it was at a basketball tournament up at 7th and O, Northwest D.C. And there were 100,000 people there, not 100,000, but there were thousands of people at this tournament, and nobody saw anything, of course.
So that's how fearful people were of.
Yeah, and it was a murder that was right out in front of everybody. But interestingly enough, Benson was a New Yorker. And the reason that he was killed was because he had spotted Martinez. And Martinez knew who he was, knew that he would immediately call the guy in New York who was gunning for him. So Martinez told that to Perry, and Perry said, "Don't worry about it." And that's how it proceeded. And that's how Benson got killed. Now, the murder of Evelyn Carter, she was a girl who was, I guess the old term was the paramour to a lot of the local drug dealers. But she was a nice young woman, but she refused to. I tried to interview her once and tried to get her to give me information on a drug dealer, and she just refused to ever cooperate with the government. She says, you don't understand. The people that I have, social relationships with would just completely cut me off if they ever found out I was talking to the police. But she was killed because she refused to have sex with Perry. But Perry told Martinez that she was killed because she was snitching. Well, she wasn't. So again, it was one of these. And then, of course, Alveda Hopkins was murdered because she had testified against him. Yolanda Burley, who was the other young woman who was killed and left on the Interstate 295 on the side of the road, she was killed because she had the temerity to ask him who he was and what he did for a living. She must be a snitch. Why would she ask me any questions?
So he killed her. I have just done, a number of episodes about serial killers. Is he a serial killer or is he a contract killer? He just thinks of whatever reason. He's killing people for whatever reason he feels is appropriate.
That's what I keep coming back to, Jerry, and I think it really comes down to that. I think he was trying to exert power. That he just wanted power, almost the sense of fear that everybody had for him. I think he thrived on that. Now, what was interesting about that was if you met him right now, you would be amazed at how pleasant, how funny, and how respectful of a person he is.
I would be amazed. He doesn't sound like that type of a person at all.
He is probably the most respectful person I ever arrested in my career. Just yes sir, no sir. And I started to do my interview, and he said, Special Agent Riley, I'd love to be able to talk to you right now, but I want to go through all this court stuff first and see where we are before I make any decisions about that. I mean, you really can't ask a really bad criminal to be any nicer than that, if you know what I'm saying.
I apologize for not being able to give you an interview at this time.
Exactly.
Oh my!
That was the approach that he took, and I was like blown away. I mean, I have interviewed some nasty people in my career, and most of them were nasty when you talk to them. But this guy was incredible and funny. Always had a pleasant story to talk about and jokes to tell and that kind of thing. I mean, I guess the best word to use it, both he and Martinez were two of the most charismatic people that you'd ever know. Clearly, they were successful at what they did, but they were successful based on the fact that they had a way to manipulate people. They had a way to work people, to their side of the story. And I found that over and over again with Perry, especially in dealing with some of the women who were his girlfriends. And he had maybe 6 to 8 girlfriends that I knew about. But he also had a couple of boyfriends.
Okay.
Including Thomas Dozier, who was one of the people that was... Thomas Dozier was the actual man who pulled the trigger on Evelyn Carter. That's kind of an interesting murder to tell the whole story about, and I'll go ahead and try to sort of explain it a little bit to you. But Perry had decided that Evelyn Carter needed to go, but he also decided that he needed to get this guy, Thomas Dozier, who had been a cellmate of his in Lorton Penitentiary, to prove himself. So he gave Dozier a gun and told him to go kill Evelyn Carter, who was going to a concert at the DAR Constitution Hall, like 2 blocks from the White House. And so Dozier waited for Carter to leave the Constitution Hall concert, walked up to her on the street, and shot her a couple of times in her upper torso. And she just fell away from him and, fell down on the sidewalk and started to bleed out. He sort of waited around to see what would happen because Perry had said, make sure that you kill her. And the ambulance came and took her away. And so he went and told Perry that. Perry said, well, you didn't shoot her in the head? And Dozier said, well, I shot her. She's dead. He says, but you didn't see her die. You didn't see her, you didn't put a bullet in her head. And he goes, well, no. And Perry got angry and upset with him and started yelling at him. He says, you can't kill anybody unless you shoot him in the head. And he walked up to a man, just a bystander, who they had no connection with, who happened to be talking on a public telephone, and just shot him in the head and said, this is how you kill somebody. All angry at Dozier for not doing it the right way. Well, of course, Evelyn.
Evil.
Yeah, Evelyn died in the hospital at George Washington University Hospital, and almost immediately. I mean, there was no issue about it, of her surviving any. But the bottom line is that's how Perry operated. In other words, if you were going to be one of his close associates, you were going to do it his way and make sure that you follow his rules. Of course, we didn't find out about it until later when Martinez ended up rolling and cooperating with us.
And why did Evelyn have to die again?
To be honest with you, the best reason I could come up with is she decided she wasn't going to have sex with Wayne. You're getting back to that issue about whether he was a serial killer or not. And I did broach the subject with the behavioral science unit, and I thought they really needed to talk to him. They really needed to get some sense of his mindset. And when I brought it up to them, they said, well, he's involved in narcotics, and he's a hitman for them, right? And I went, yeah, but, some of his motives for murder just don't square with, like, the so-called business motive that you expect to hear from a hitman. And so they said, well, at that particular point, they defined a serial killer as somebody who was a psychosexual killer. And they couldn't define Wayne that way.
Wow. When
the BAU told me that, I said, okay, fine. So I didn't pursue it anymore with them about whether or not they should follow up, just in terms of getting a psychological profile. I did the best I could as a case agent. I had Psych 101 and a couple of things like that in college, but that was about it. So, I was just amazed by the guy.